severe budget cuts really decimated the supply of
Yes, that
federally assisted public
have,
housing.
that have increasingly, excuse me, now my throat's getting dry.
You need to ask me the same question after you ask her. Ask it about homelessness.
Okay.
There are 294,000 religious congregations in the United States. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish traditions share a commitment to social justice. They shelter the homeless, feed the hungry, and provide counseling, health care, and daycare to those in need. Working together with elected officials at local, state, and national levels, faith-based individuals are making an impact.
Hello. Welcome to Making an Impact. From Washington, D.C., I'm Gretchen Ike. We're here today to look at a couple of issues that are overlapping crises facing our nation right now. One is the crisis of housing, the shortage of available housing, particularly available housing for low-income people. And the other is the crisis of homelessness. Our guests are Jerry Hamilton. Jerry Hamilton is the Assistant Director of the Department of Human Welfare with the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church, a position that she's held for the past 12 years, or for the past 2 years, and worked for the United Methodist Church for the last 12 years. Jerry chairs the task force on housing of the interreligious communities Washington staff, the national staff of the various denominations and religious groups that work together in Washington as advocates on housing policy. And she's also on the board of the Interreligious Coalition on Housing. Delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
Jerry. Our other guest is Pam Holler, who's the shelter administrator of Luther Place Shelter Ministries of Luther Place Memorial Church in Washington, D.C. Pam has also worked in Arlington, Virginia, making linkages between churches and other nonprofit organizations and the Arlington County government. And we're delighted to have you here also, Pam.
Thank you.
Let's try to unlock for our viewers why we're putting these two issues together in this program. And maybe as a start, to take a look at the question of the housing crisis. Just what is the housing crisis that faces our nation right now? Jerry, could you give a little description
Sure.
for us?
What I'd like to do first, perhaps, is to give you some statistical information which would help you to begin to understand the disparity between the lack of affordable housing, and then go into some of the subsidies and talk about some of the programs that have also contributed to the crisis.
The programs of the federal government.
Yes, that the
supporting
federal government has instituted, and now some
Uh-huh.
of these programs are coming to an end. The shortage that we have at this point says to us that there are 1 in 3 poor renter households that did not receive any federal, state, or local subsidy, or any persons that might have lived in public housing in 1987. Most of the poor applicants are put on a waiting list with hundreds of other names, and they may have to wait for years before they even receive any assistance. During the 1980s, government cuts reduced low-income new housing by 74%, and that sharp reduction of affordable housing versus the burgeoning of poor renter households served to swell the number of poor households, renters not receiving any housing assistance by at least 25%.
So we're talking about a great growth in the numbers of people who are living in the low income level, householders living at the low income level. And we're talking about curtailing and cutting back federal funding for low income housing. Is that?
Well, that's part of it.
I guess that we're also talking about, excuse me for breaking in, but we're also talking about a time when everybody is experiencing the rising cost in housing. Housing costs, according to the National Association of Home Builders, I was reading the other day, between 1970 and 1983, the median rents increased 2 times as fast as the increase in median income.
That's correct.
Which is incredible. Yes. We all feel it as we look at how much
yes.
our housing costs now versus what it did a few years ago.
Under federal housing standards, housing is considered affordable, which means you pay the rent and the utilities, if no more than 30% of your income is used. In 1985, 5 out of 6 persons, or 5.8 million renter households, or 73% of those persons, paid at least 30% of their income for housing.
And it's actually, isn't it, I think you were saying earlier, there's even as many as almost half of those low-income families were paying
correct.
up to 70%
That's correct.
of their income in housing, which is incredible when you figure it out, when you figure out trying to supply everything, all your other needs from that 30% remaining.
Well, it basically, the government looks at it this way. They consider you to be poor household if your income is less than $10,000, and that could be 2 people working. And you're considered very poor if your household income is $5,000 or less. So for persons who are bringing in that kind of money, it's either pay your rent and be evicted, or you decide whether or not you eat that month.
We have a chart actually that shows the percentage of income that people are paying on housing, and it might give our viewers a little bit of sense of what we're talking about. The gap between rich and poor in this country is really widening at a pretty fast clip. The Census Bureau says that now we are at the widest gap between rich and poor from any time since we began keeping records and statistics on this. I think the earliest time we kept the statistics was 1947. Pam, could you say a little bit about the other crisis we're dealing with? Because we're saying that there's a housing crisis, a shortage of available housing, and particularly affecting low-income people. And there's also a crisis of growing numbers of homelessness and changing dimensions and changing face of who is homeless. From your work as a shelter coordinator, what do you see?
Clearly there are growing numbers of homeless people in the United States. You see it every day on the streets of Washington. All you need to do is come out of the subway and inevitably there's someone sitting there who is homeless. You walk along the streets by the White House, there are plenty of homeless people around. We're seeing a continuing increase and change in the kind of people who are coming to our shelter, which is a program for women. So it's not typical of the country, but we're seeing more and more people coming to us. The shelter population grows partially because a lot of the solutions to homelessness are not growing, so that just increases the number of people who are in the streets. A combination of the people that Jerry was talking about who are at that borderline poverty rate, who at some point have to make that choice between living in a house or eating and may eventually get evicted, will end up homeless. And the growing group of that is families, unfortunately, with children. There are also.
Are there any figures on that? What percentage of the homeless that are growing are families with children?
I can't.
I think I'd read something like 30 to 40%.
Yeah, 30
is that
to 40%,
what you?
and it grows every day. We also have the homeless people who are mentally ill or the victims of substance abuse, veterans. Once you're out there in the streets, all of those problems just increase for you. If you're not, I've heard psychiatrists say that if you're not mentally ill, when you become homeless, living on the streets, living in shelters can easily make your mental health very, very marginal. So what we have is a situation where the problem continues to increase and the solutions are not increasing, and so the shelter world is becoming the new low-income housing in the United States, becoming more and more permanent rather than going away.
And as families break up, as divorces happen, and there's increasing numbers of women are trying to operate as single-parent families, the situation is likely to get much worse. And particularly as we see the trends of the cost of housing, the numbers of people at the younger levels that are able to actually become homeowners is shrinking dramatically. Well, there are other dimensions to this problem we haven't touched on, I think. One is that you were saying, Jerry, a little before we started filming, that the problem of the federal programs that gave private developers a little bit of an incentive to rent to low-income families that have now been really are kind of either running out of time or just say,
yes.
Say a little more about that.
What I was talking about was that there are private developers who had mortgage loans that had a 40-year lease on them. And they had an option in that contract that if they wanted to pay off the lease within 20 years, they had the option to do that. And a lot of these private developers who are interested in making profit for themselves, who have decided that they no longer want to use those properties for low and moderate income units, have paid those mortgages off And within the next 2 to 3 years, not several, but many of the developers will not have to keep those units as low and moderate income facilities. Therefore, those persons are going to be homeless.
I think I read somewhere a rather incredible statistic that we're talking about maybe a quarter of all the federally promoted private construction that's now being rented by low-income families going off the market through these programs, running their course.
Well, some of the other programs that have basically also turned us around to where we have this crisis is that substantial amounts of the programs and the assistance that's given has been done for middle and upper income families through these tax credits. They can take tax deductions for their mortgage interest payments and property taxes, and poor persons who do not own a home don't have that advantage. In fact,
are you saying in a sense that there's a subsidy that goes to middle income and upper income people?
Yes, most persons think that subsidies go to persons who live on welfare or persons who are what we just talked about a moment ago of poor households. But lately, in the last 8 years, it's the middle class and upper middle class and above who have been able to use these tax credits because they own their homes, they have incomes of $50,000 or better, and they are able to use these tax credits to their advantage, whereas a poor family making $5,000 or $10,000 does not have that.
And what I think what you're also saying is that as we talk about mortgage interest payments that we can take off those of us who are homeowners, deductions that we can take on our taxes.
Oh, yes.
That's really costing the federal government large numbers of dollars, and that is in a sense a subsidy to
the
us.
amount of subsidies that have gone from the federal government to middle and upper class persons is triple the amount that has gone to low income persons.
It's incredible.
Yes, it is. There's analysis that are going around now which are forecasting that the gap between the number of low-income households and the number of units that are affordable, that gap is going to grow substantially larger in the coming years. And another reason for that is the expiration of federal housing commitments that had been made through former programs through the Reagan administration. In the next 5 years, it's approximated that 1 million households for low-income persons will expire. These contracts will expire, and if the persons who own these buildings do not renew these contracts so that they stay for low and moderate income persons, those persons will become homeless.
Which brings us right back to the other problem we're talking about tonight, today, which is the issue of homelessness. Pam, there was an interesting story, an interesting article some time ago by Jonathan Kozol, where he was talking about this, how we're almost institutionalizing homeless people. Right. Could you share a little bit with us about that?
Yeah. Luther Place is something of an example of that. In some ways, we try hard not to think of ourselves as institutionalizing, but if you look at our history, we started in 1976 as a simple wintertime shelter with mats on the floor of a church building, and simple supper or simple breakfast and out during the day, and now we've grown to 4 night shelters, 2 group homes, and a day center, all for women.
My word, all supported by one congregation.
All supported by one congregation, and a lot of help from other congregations who are our friends. But what it says is that, yes, we've done a wonderful job at our work, but the need has just increased and increased and increased, and as we've tried to respond to that, we've become more and more and more established. Instead of going out of business and putting people into housing, we've found that that's not an option at this point, so we need to provide other kinds of in-between services trying to move people along. And it's becoming very much of a institutionalized place. As he said in that article, he said low-income housing of the 1980s and 90s is shelters, and that doesn't make any sense. That's temporary.
So instead of helping people take the short-term crisis of being without housing or being homeless and move out of that, we're really developing so many structures to deal with homelessness in a very separate kind of separate bureaucracy and so forth, that we may indeed be getting ourselves into a place where we're exacerbating the problem of the great huge gap between rich and poor in our country, which is becoming such a serious one. But hasn't the federal government been pouring money into housing and homeless programs? I mean, it seems like there's been a lot of money going in.
Well, you hear persons say that. But HUD study has shown that more than half of all the households in public housing that need rehabilitation, it's going to take about $20 billion just to satisfy that need. That isn't talking about anything
So
else.
just repairing
just
the existing
to repair
low-income housing.
what exists. We're not even talking about new construction. In 1989, the funding to take care of that particular problem was $1.6 billion. And the Bush administration has produced $1 billion
Has called for
has
in their
called
budget?
has called for $1
So
billion
they've cut
in 1990. They've cut
considerably the money
yes,
that's
they've
going
cut
to
it. And
repair that
yes,
housing.
and so that means that the rehab probably will not take place. When you look at the federal budget and you think that that $319 billion can be spent on missiles and bombs, and yet we can't even help our people who live here in the United States of America get off the streets and become useful citizens again, because that's basically what most of them were before this tragic crisis happened to them. It's very sad. It makes you feel as if you know, it's more important to build homes for these bombs, and so that they can sit in storage and wait for, I guess, whatever the big day is, rather than deal with the problem at hand, which is, you know, we need to get our people off the streets and back into jobs.
Yes. One of the questions that we get asked at Impact quite regularly in letters that we get from people in congregations, it was phrased very well recently by a 15-year-old girl who wrote saying, I'm 15 years old and I attend Roosevelt High School in Fresno, California. I'm involved with a church youth group and we're presently sponsoring a child in India, but I feel very sad when my family drives downtown in Fresno and sees people sleeping on the benches at night, and I feel frightened for them. I want to do something to help them, but I don't know what to do, and I'm not that rich either. What are the kinds of things that people in congregations and religious communities can be doing, both at the public policy level in terms of advocating specific legislation, and also really at the personal level in terms of what congregations or individuals who want to be of help, like this young girl does?
Churches like Luther Place that are running shelters can always use help with volunteers who help staff our overnights, who help staff our various shifts, casseroles, food, just simple, basic kinds of things to keep the ministry going. Churches who want to get more involved in that, there are lots and lots of options. They can rent an apartment and pay part of the rent of an apartment and put a family in there working through their local social service agency or through a shelter program or something.
Isn't that just a way to eat up dollars, though? I mean, if you're only helping one family with an apartment, is that what you're...
Still, it's one family, though, that
Yeah.
otherwise would either be in a shelter or using public money, or trying to find public money that's not been very available. So it's a way to understand the problem and a way to get some people moving back in. Another way is to do one of the things that we have done at Luther Place and have worked with other congregations to get started, which is a group home concept, where you either buy a house or you rent a house and you provide it as home for, what we do is 8 women who pay rent and who pay for their own food, and we have a staff person who visits them once a week and makes sure everything is going right. But there's a supportive environment, but not a lot of services and intense, social work that has to go along with it.
It's a way of helping people become a little more independent,
yes,
in a somewhat sheltered environment.
Right, and these women are women who will probably never be able to live totally independently because of their mental illness or whatever.
Maybe even because of their earning power.
Right, and so that the rents that they pay are much less than they would pay at the market level. They have a supportive community with each other, yet they're living independently with dignity.
If people are interested in finding out about what you're doing at Luther Place Church and models that you've developed that they may be able to use in their own congregations, we want to make sure our viewers know how to get in touch with you. So we're going to show on the screen the Luther Place address number.
Good. Okay.
We've talked about what can be done in local congregations. What about legislation? Is there legislation afoot, and are there other programs that people can be involved with in terms of ways to really demonstrate in their own local community just how massive the need is?
Yes. Part of the responsibility of the church is to be the prophetic voice against injustice. And I think that's a unique role that we play, because we are not in this for profit. We are not in it for money. We are in it because we care. We have the power to vote, which is most important, that we exercise that right so that equitable laws can be passed. Legislation on housing, which is a very complex issue, can take a very long time for it to work its way through the legislature. So we ask persons who may be watching this program to say to others, write to your congressperson and let them know that you insist that they take it upon themselves to ensure passage of legislation that will encompass persons who are moderate and low-income persons. There are two bills in Congress now, one in the Senate and one in the House, and they're omnibus bills, which means that they pretty much have taken and swallowed up any of the smaller bills, housing bills that have been introduced in the last year or two. The National Affordable Housing Act, which was sponsored by Senator Alan Cranston from California, S 565 and 566, is a bill that does not deal with low-income housing. Our task force group of the religious denominations at the Methodist Building, we've studied this bill. We've had persons from Cranston's office come and talk with us.
If it doesn't deal with low-income housing, you're supporting it?
No.
No.
And
Oh,
I
you're
didn't
not.
say we're
Okay.
supporting it.
Okay.
I said we've studied it.
Yeah.
And that's why we know that it doesn't encompass low-income housing.
Is there one thing you would say to people that you'd like to see them raise within their congregations and with
Yes,
those
I
who
would-
represent them in the Congress?
I would say to them that they would write to Senator Cranston and say to him, whether they're from California or not, say to him that this bill must work with the problem, and the problem is in the low and moderate income.
So it must be expanded to
Yes,
really
it must be
address
expanded.
the needs.
Now,
named.
the other bill is H.R. 1180, which is sponsored by Congressman Gonzalez from Texas, and it's called the Housing and Community Development Act. This bill is all-inclusive. It has your new construction, it has rehab, it has low-income programs, it has a variety of pieces that kind of fit the puzzle and will make the whole picture look a little bit brighter.
If people were interested in more information on either of these bills, they could be in touch with Impact and with any of
Right.
the national organizations
Yes.
that are involved with Impact, which will be scrolling at the end of our show.
I just want to add a bit to what Jerry has said, and that's that one of the things that's important about volunteering and churches getting directly involved is that they understand the issues much better and can be that prophetic voice saying what needs to be done in terms of justice. Going and being in a shelter gives you a whole new perspective on what the issue is, and you can speak out from your heart, from your conscience in a different way.
I suspect that working where you do also, when people say to you, can't the churches take on the full responsibility for this problem? Why should we get involved at all with advocacy or looking at legislation? I suspect that's an issue that you cringe a little bit about. Is charity enough?
Charity is not enough. The issue is justice, the issue is not charity, and what the churches in a direct service mode can do is charity, and that's a stopgap Band-Aid measure. We can provide food, we can provide shelter. That doesn't get people out of homelessness. What gets people out of homelessness is working on the problems that got them into that state in the first place, whether it's education, job training, mental health therapy, whatever, and then it's finding them housing, affordable, appropriate housing that at the moment doesn't exist.
The three of us having this discussion are all women, and that's not an accident, because the problems we've been talking about, both homelessness and housing, the housing crisis, are increasingly affecting women and children. And I think that's something that it's important for us to be aware of and remind people in our congregations. More than half of all poor households now in our country are headed by women. And the growing, as you said earlier, the growing number of, the largest group growing among the homeless is women and children, single-family households. Jerry, there's an event coming up in October, and I wondered if you'd be willing to share with the viewers a little bit about this, the Housing Now call for massive public presence.
Our
witnessing.
community is quite excited about the Housing Now March. It's going to be October 5, 6, and 7. October 5 and 6 will be the lobby days, which is most important because when persons come to Capitol Hill, we want to take thousands and thousands of people into those congressional offices so that the representatives and the senators will see that it's not just the people that they see every day who have a concern about this issue.
Religious groups, unions, educational groups, all
Yes.
all kinds of organizations are gathering around this, trying to say that the housing crisis is a major, major.
And the activity to culminate the entire event will be on October 7th, which will be the actual march itself.
If people are interested in getting more information about Housing Now and about the march and this major mobilization of all kinds of people from all walks of life, the number is available on our screen for them to be able to call for some more information. one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Jerry, about the reason the religious community gets involved with issues like this, I think is something worth highlighting because it's so true that there really are very few other organizations that are serving as advocates for those who are disadvantaged, oppressed, unable to really keep their body and soul together, much less to be able to be doing advocacy with the Congress. There have been a number of studies of the religious community's work in Washington which have cited that one aspect as being a very, very important protection for our democracy, that we have people within the religious community voicing their opinion and talking with legislators about these issues that affect the lives of 13 million low-income households. Are there other dimensions to this that we ought to be raising? Are there personal stories that you have from your own work in the shelters, or are there aspects that we've been leaving out?
I could tell lots of personal stories from my work in the shelter. I guess the message I want to say about the personal stories is that the people who are homeless have been rejected, neglected, trampled on, stepped over at subway stops, walked by, ignored. They feel faceless. They have no self-esteem. And important in all this is to make them recognize that they are indeed children of God. They indeed have something that they can contribute to society despite the way society has treated them. And a role for all of us is to say something to a homeless person. I mean, it's as simple as that. It's a simple little piece. A lot of what I do is just sit and listen and talk to these women who for a long time have not had their voices heard, and just hear their stories and work with them to make them believe that they can get out of their homelessness. And
you brought with you a couple of photographs of some of the folks that are working that Luther Place Church is working with.
Mm-hmm. We have just a wide variety of women. From our oldest resident is 80 years old, our youngest at the moment I think is 19, and we have everything in between. More and more of our women have children. While we don't take children in the shelter, a lot of them have children and they're in foster care or in some sort of extended family situation, so that the whole question of trying to be reunited once they get out of their homelessness and work as a family again is just another obstacle and burden that they have to work through as they come out and move toward independence.
And that's another challenge for religious communities doing direct service to the homeless. How do we find ways to really support the family, so that people don't have to be separated, because that's a devastating aspect to the whole problem that people are facing. What do you see as you look ahead from the data that you witness, either personally or in terms of the research that you've done with the task force that you're chairing, Jerry? What do you see in the future? What do you see coming? Do you see the situation getting much better, or what solutions do you see?
Well, for me, working on a national level in Washington, D.C., our group sees our role in the religious community as one of being very important because of the type of crisis that this whole housing and homelessness issue has done, and that we want to be in the forefront of this justice issue to show to others that it's not necessary to make a buck every time you think you might want to go out and do something, that the caring and the love that Jesus showed for all people, no matter what color, no matter what their walk of life was, that this is the most important thing.
Seeing that human face in the half of the homeless who are vets, or in the 30 to 40% of the homeless who are women and children, and in the homeless that are drug addicted and alcoholics and mentally ill, and keeping that human face before us.
And not condemning it.
And not condemning it.
I'm trying to understand what it was that got that person there, and standing and walking with them as they try to get out of it. Condemning them isn't going to help them at all.
We are going to be gathering again for our next show, looking at issues of global warming and environmental crisis. So I wanted to have a chance to say to you, thank you very much for the perspective that you brought today to this discussion. I think each of you in your own way is contributing in a very powerful way to trying to make the situation better, and we'll hope that with more and more people getting their consciousness raised to how serious a crisis we face, both in the housing and the homeless area, and getting their minds opened a little bit as to who the people are who are affected. And the point that you made before about the subsidy that that middle class people are already getting for their housing, not forgetting about that. That hopefully we will add numbers and numbers of people to those that are expressing their views within congregations, working in direct service, and talking with those who represent them in Washington as well.
It's important for people to realize that they can make a difference. I mean, they can make a difference in direct service. Their voice in Congress can make a difference.
Yes.
Every voice added together makes a big ripple.
Yes.
And housing can seem very overwhelming because it's so expensive and it's such a big issue. Individuals and churches are not faithful until they're speaking out.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Making an Impact.
Sometimes I feel my dreams don't matter, that I am just too small.